Russians continue their attempts to advance near Bakhmut using tanks and armored vehicles. The tanks are hiding behind a smokescreen, while the infantry is crawling on the ground in fear. A tank equipped with a mine-clearing device advanced forward. Its mission is to clear a path for the other tanks through the minefield. A Ukrainian drone dropped a grenade on it, but unfortunately missed. Then the tank was hit by a Soviet RPG anti-tank missile. Although the tank remained undamaged, the crew was likely stunned by the explosion and could not continue with the mission. One of the Russian armored personnel carriers was hit by a Javelin missile. Shortly thereafter, another vehicle was destroyed by a direct hit. The Russians were forced to abandon the infantry carrier and take cover in trenches. Another tank from the same group attempted to maneuver but was blown up by a mine. Its track was detached and the crew abandoned the tank. One more tank eventually attempted to leave the battlefield but was hit by a Javelin missile. This is evidence from the trajectory of the missile, which came from above. This is precisely how the Javelin missile operates. Later, this tank was completely burned. The Ukrainians also burned several abandoned Russian armored vehicles. As a result, the Russian advance was stopped by the coordinated actions of the Ukrainian forces. However, the enemy infantry still managed to break through to the urban area in the northern part of the Bakhmut city, and Ukrainian tanks have to drive them out from there. In these destroyed houses, the war is fought for every wall and every stone. To push the enemies out of the city, Ukrainian forces are increasingly using tanks. Tanks are targeting enemy infantry, armored vehicles, and other transport vehicles. Sometimes, tanks leave the city limits to repel the invasion of enemy infantry and prevent them from penetrating the city. When returning back, tanks are covered with a smokescreen. The enemy is not allowed into the city. Ukrainian soldiers rode out on an armored Italian-made Iveco vehicle to repel the advance of Russian infantry. The Russians opened fire, but the windshield withstood a direct hit from an enemy bullet aimed at the driver. Throughout the battle, the windshield endured numerous bullets, and the soldiers returned alive after completing their mission. Meanwhile, Bakhmut is becoming more and more like a ghost town. Hundreds of houses have turned into ruins, leaving peaceful people homeless. It hardly makes sense to rebuild the city in the future. Perhaps it would be easier to build a new city, leaving Bakhmut as a monument to future generations. Recently, the Russians have begun to use their Lancet kamikaze drones more often, destroying valuable examples of Ukrainian weapons. In these footage, you can see how a Russian kamikaze drone destroys a Ukrainian RM-70 MLRS. The explosion is huge as the shells detonated. RM-70 was delivered to Ukraine by the Czech Republic. The system can fire various types of missiles, including precision-guided, cluster, and incendiary missiles up to 15 miles. And in this video, a Lancet destroys a Ukrainian fuel truck. The fuel spilled onto the ground and ignited, causing a huge fire. And here, you can see how the Lancet destroys the Ukrainian Buk air defense system, also a very valuable weapon. In fact, enemy drones cause a lot of problems for the Ukrainian army, destroying various types of weapons. During a war, weapons can undergo a complex and lengthy journey. Here is an interesting example of this. Here is a repaired Ukrainian self-propelled howitzer M1990 It is capable of throwing 100-pound projectiles up to 15 miles. Interestingly, before that, the howitzer was hit by a Russian Lancet kamikaze drone, but did not receive significant damage. And even before that, the same self-propelled howitzer destroyed the Russian ammunition depot. We learned this from the Ukrainian troops of the 3rd Assault Brigade, but the most interesting thing is that the same howitzer was originally captured from the Russians themselves as a trophy last year. Ukrainians have seized over 50 such howitzers throughout the war, some of which were simply abandoned by the Russians during their retreat. The Russians hit a truck with ammunition in a forest plantation, but Ukrainian artillerymen spotted it and hit it, causing the ammunition to explode and the truck to burn down. Such a truck could have carried up to 5 tons of ammunition. Russian troops use such trucks to transport ammunition as they are highly maneuverable in field conditions. However, They also become a prime target for the Ukrainian army. Many such trucks have been destroyed along with their ammunition. In this video, we see how the Ukrainians hit a similar truck while the Russians were unloading ammunition from it. The truck caught fire, and the Russians didn't know what to do with it. Within a minute, the ammunition exploded, and the truck suddenly started moving on its own until it burned down completely. The nearby vehicle also caught fire. Ukrainian generals have created impassable fortified positions in the city. They have turned Bakhmut into a fortress, which Russian forces are breaking their most combat-ready troops against. Angry Russian generals often order the use of phosphorus ammunition over the city, especially at night. It looks beautiful like fireworks, but it's very dangerous. This type of munition explodes in the air and scatters phosphorus particles over a wide area. These particles are difficult to extinguish and ignite anything they come into contact with, which leads to fires and causes burns to Ukrainian soldiers. Phosphorus ammunition also releases toxic fumes that can cause poisoning if inhaled. But despite the difficult situation, the Ukrainian soldiers do not use their presence of mind and even manage to joke. A sense of humor allows them to keep the psyche healthy. War is an ordeal. Every day, Ukrainians lose equipment and people in the battles for their country, but they continue to fight. Fierce trench warfare continues around Bakhmut. The ground is a soldier's best friend, so Ukrainians are digging deeper by any means necessary to protect themselves from enemy shelling. The main thing is not to allow the enemy to get close enough to throw a grenade into your trench. To achieve this, constant fire from automatic rifles and machine guns is necessary to keep the enemy from raising their head. After such battles, the trenches are covered with spent cartridges. Millions of cartridges cover the ground. You can imagine how intense the fighting must be in Bakhmut. But the enemy keeps advancing, sparing no lives. Meanwhile, Ukraine continues to accumulate military equipment and prepare for the decisive battle. More and more Western armored vehicles are arriving in Ukraine, and Ukrainian soldiers are returning from training on European ranges. A major counteroffensive by the Ukrainian army is expected, during which Ukraine plans to regain all of its territories. The Russian army is noticeably weakening. They can no longer carry out large-scale offensive operations, and in many areas of the front have switched to defense. They are refurbishing tanks from the 1950s, which they hope will stand up against the new British Challengers and German Leopards. Historic battles await us in the very near future. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to leave your comments and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any new videos.